guys are ready to get started, I'm ready to get started. So thanks for showing up early and or on time. A couple of things. Would you guys mind sharing with me, just by a show of hands, who you are and how you fit into the industry? So as I start to talk about things, I can sort of know how best to address you. So are there any brand owners here? Okay. Retail owners? Wow, all right. Was that a hand in the back?
Sorry.
Okay. Entrepreneurs that want to get into the industry? Okay, now we're talking. Bud tenders? Okay. Who else am I missing?
Growers.
Sorry?
Growers.
Growers, cultivators. Okay, cool.
And ancillary services like HR and bookkeeping management and stuff.
Okay. Right on. No, I know, and that's great, And so I'll start off by saying, when you talk about branding or marketing, it means so many things to so many people. Some things go over certain people's heads, while you can double click or triple click and debate on other things with other people. So I just want to know how you guys understand how you think about branding and how I can add value. Last thing I want to do is talk to a group of people and you guys leave and it's sort of like, what did he say? So I'm just trying to connect, and I think the best way of doing that is knowing where you come from in the industry. Okay, so I'm here to talk about branding and marketing, primarily branding of cannabis. I'll talk about how cannabis branding has changed slightly over time, how it continues to change, and how it's not very different from consumer product goods marketing as things start to normalize. So with that, let me give you just a brief introduction about who I am. So pretty much, I think the years, if you can do math, you start to realize I'm an old guy. But basically, I've spent 25 years at American Express, Pepsi, MasterCard, and Microsoft in branding and marketing. So that's great. That just tells the group that I understand what branding and marketing is. And then I always run into, in the cannabis space, well, what do you know about cannabis? So I've been around cannabis my entire life, I should say, as a professional skateboarder when I was younger. But over the last 8 years, more specifically, I left Microsoft and started to work with some of the folks my friends that were leaving Microsoft and Starbucks and Amazon to start dispensaries and retail shops and brands. And I realized pretty quickly that I could work with my friends who knew me and knew that I had an understanding of cannabis, but as I started to work with other people in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm from New York, they'd look at me and they'd say, "You're a corporate guy, you don't even look like you know anything about cannabis." And as I started to smoke with them or dab with them or spend time with them, or in their grows, and started to talk about terps and all the other things, they understood that I was one of them and that I get it. And they probably shouldn't look at me and judge me. But so long story short, I've spent the last 6 to 8 years at Dope Magazine, initially helping them basically align their magazine with their actions and their promises is probably the best way to say it. There's often things that, whether it's at the level of Dope or whether it's the level of other types of brands, where there are promises made and then there's a disconnect. So I came in and helped them do that. I've written about branding, I've talked about branding, I've been a High Times Cannabis Cup judge, so on and so forth. So it's been about 8 years that I've been in the industry, so I think I can speak to, and I address that now because I know I probably look like a suit to most of you, and I fit right in where I need to. Cool, so with that, so does branding matter? Initially, I remember not too long ago, I was in New York roaming the streets for dime bags, and I was happy to get whatever I could get at Washington Square Park. There was never any conversation about an indica or a sativa or anything like that, or a THC content level, so on and so forth. So does branding matter? As a branding and marketing guy, I would say it does, but let's even take, for a moment, a Psychology 101 class here. So our basic needs, so if you think about Maslow's hierarchy, right? At the very bottom of this pyramid, there's basic needs. It's food and shelter. And then as we start to get ascend, there's love and acceptance, and there's all these other things. And finally, most of us that live in the United States and are in the cannabis industry are at the very top of the pyramid. And what that means is most of our general needs are taken care of. And now we look for things to associate with that, that basically we put our personality into and we use to create our personality. And those are labels, those are brands, those are all the things that we use to associate with different groups and different people that speak to everyone before we even get to speak. And that's, I guess, in some ways why I started off by saying I know I probably look like a suit to most of you, but I'm not. So with that, you know, let's just even take a car, for example. A car used to be about transportation and getting from point A to point B. The car's not about that anymore. We all pretty much can get to point A, from point A to point B. Now it's about a status symbol. Now it's about what car do you drive, and who and what's associated with all of that. And essentially, brands all the way through, whether it's the car you drive or the chocolate you eat, you know, it's all the same thing. So I would argue that brands do matter, and brands are important. And as you decide who you are and you go through your life, you're picking certain brands that reflect your visions, your thoughts, your aspirations. And that's where basically brands always try to hit you. You know, if it's Nike, it's just do it, right? It's all these things that just try to create all the hooks that you need to basically feel better about yourself or to associate with a certain group, so on and so forth. So with that, that's what brands are all about at the basic core. So when somebody comes into a cannabis shop and they're looking for a brand, they start to look at certain things and certain cues and certain messaging. And with that, that's how they essentially land on a brand. And if it feels good, and if they're rewarded for that, whether it's the efficacy of a brand, whether it's, hey, you see a certain logo on my body, or I drive a certain car, and that's reinforced, then people are going to go back and keep on buying those brands, right? So there's a certain level of consistency. You know, it's sort of risk, reward, and then if it works, it's consistent. So let's just take a couple of look at a couple of things. So what's a brand, right? People could say a brand is a name or a logo or a package, but the truth is it's all of that rolled up, and then basically the true meaning is pretty straightforward. A brand is what your product or service stands for. So if you separate the physical product or service for a moment, what is it that you're looking for? What is it that your brand is offering? Is it offering purity? Is it offering the best high? Is it offering safety? Those sorts of things. A medicinal brand might be the safest brand. Someone might look at that and say, hey, you know, the box is white, the package is white, it looks hermetically sealed. I feel good about that. And basically, it's those cues that are reinforced time and time again that make up a brand. So how do you define your brand? Defining your brand is basically as important for a cannabis company as it is for any consumer good product or service. So who are you? Why do you exist? Is your product better than any other offering? And how do you improve your customers' lives? So again, it could either be a real offering, or it can be a pseudo offering, but it feels like it's right. So basically, more than ever, right? Brands are all about stories and the backstories and everything around them. So if you think about your brand, as if you're starting one or have one, or thinking about getting into the business, you know, what's the story behind your brand and what makes a brand relevant today? So typically it's product history, where the brand came from, its inception, the inventor perhaps, or the brand founders, an aspirational message. You know, even though Phil Knight is well known, people don't often think Nike when they hear Phil Knight, like they might think Steve Jobs and Apple. So, you know, or Richard Branson and Virgin. So the brand founder may be played up or might not be played up. Jake Burton is a really good example for Burton Snowboards, where, you know, he was one of the first. He did what he did, but he was always the front man, and then they brought somebody, the business people behind it, to basically push him out in front and be that that brand story. An aspirational message, again, just do it, and things like that, where it's more about pushing you to do something or inspiring you. The product quality is often, again, a level of something that rises to the occasion. You could have a great story and your product sucks, or isn't strong enough, or doesn't live up to the promise, isn't pure enough. You know, if you talk about a cultivator that doesn't use pesticides, and all of a sudden everyone finds out they do use pesticides, that ruins your promise, right? And again, it comes down to trust. So really, you know, some of these are meaningful. Well, actually, they should all be meaningful if done right. But at the end of the day, some satisfy a need and some don't. But more importantly, it's about consistency. So as long as you make your customer feel good, and the risk that they take to put your brand on their body or consume their brand is rewarded, then it's repeated. I had a friend in from San Diego last week in Seattle, and we were running around town, and he was hungry, and he said, "There's a McDonald's, let's stop there." And everyone in the car just like gasped. And he was like, "Did I say something wrong?" And I just said, "I don't think too many people around here eat McDonald's." And of course, I'm sure plenty of people eat McDonald's around there. It just wasn't the 4 people in my car. You know, but that's the whole thing. So now he all of a sudden knows that eating McDonald's isn't accepted amongst the people in the car, and now he gets it. You know, I guess his reward wasn't there for the risk he took by saying that. So everybody relates to a brand in a positive way or not, and that's important. So how do you craft a brand story? I mean, just like a writer, you should really think about in 3 tiers. There's a beginning of the brand story, there's a middle, and there's an end. And when I talk about this, when I say end, I'm not talking about an exit strategy as an entrepreneur. I'm talking about the life cycle of a brand, and what do you talk about, and when do you talk about things, and how do you talk about them. And those things change. Those things change based on your scale. You know, you might be a small cultivator initially, and then all of a sudden you're growing. You have investors, and now you have multiple facilities, and you're producing product in a different way, or you're changing the brand along the way. You still have to communicate these things to your customers in a way that makes sense. And you can always basically change that story. And actually, if you're a real brand that interacts with customers, you will have to change that story. You know, I think one example is, or a good example is building trust. So Starbucks does a fairly good job at building trust amongst their consumers and the public. And then all of a sudden something happens with a bathroom incident at one of their stores, and everybody sort of says, "Hey, wait a second, is Starbucks really the brand? You know, can I trust them as much as I thought?" And dare I even say, in today's general environment where everything is fake news and nobody believes what anybody is saying anymore, I think we're in a time where branding and marketing is even more difficult. Because the idea in branding and marketing is to create your bar, right? You set a bar for yourself, and you always have to clear that bar. You're making promises to people, and you always have to deliver on those promises. Otherwise, you're just lying to your customers. So as soon as you slip up, and there's even today people waiting for you to slip up or trying to make you slip up, it's important you know, to understand that and to be ready for those things. And I would even say, too, just quickly, off tangent here, I often see in Washington State many of the cannabis companies battling each other and looking for each other to fuck up so they could call stuff on the LCB. And I would just say, you know, this is just my personal feelings and a side note, I think it's important for us to be supportive of our competitors and think about how, you know, we can all build a better industry for everybody to be better in, and for everybody to supply better products and more consistent products to consumers. But anyway, those are the things to be mindful as your brand changes and grows. and you have competition, the story that you need to be ready for is you start to craft it and continue to craft it. So standing for something. It's important to stand for something. You know, if you're going to build a brand, you should say, what are the pillars and what are the tenets of my brand? So, you know, whether it's Tom's Shoes, where you buy one and they send another pair of shoes somewhere else around the world to a person in need of shoes, they stand for something. You know, there's so many companies that talk about purity of their product, and in fact, they use pesticides and they do all these things, and those that get caught sort of lose their brand pretty quickly, and we've seen that happen, certainly up in Washington. So, you know, other things, what do you stand for? You can be in the cannabis industry and you can be a cultivator and sell flower. You can be in the cannabis industry now and sell transdermal patches or sublingual slips. And those really, when you think about it, are so different. So the cultivator that's over here growing and doing all the different things that a cultivator does, focused on soils and nutrients and all the other, and lighting and all the other things that are happening here, we think as a blanket, it's like, hey, it's the cannabis industry, everybody should know, where, you know, there's processors over here that actually don't even know the difference between indica and sativa, and they've got somebody sourcing it and they're extracting and they're putting it into the form factors that they need to put it into. So when we even talk about the cannabis industry, it's hard to sort of wrap your head around all of it, because I don't necessarily, you could say consumer product goods, but if you're talking about soda pop over here and Band-Aids over here, that's a really big spread. But because we're a new and budding industry, it's all, well, and probably because it's all illegal federally, it's all rolled up into one. So we sort of have to deal with it all at once. But standing for something. So again, delivering on what you promise is probably the point here. And if you're first creating a brand, it's really important to think about what are those brand pillars and tenets, and what are the things that are going to come up across the lifespan of your brand that might challenge those pillars and tenets. So basically, seeing the end in the beginning is really, in some ways, what it's all about. So, so just quickly here, by the way, I just have to say this. I used this picture specifically, just to, because I know if I walked into a store and I saw flour in a bag like that, I would roll my eyes and just keep walking. So, but other people would see that and be like, yo, there's a bag of weed. That's awesome. So, so I just want to talk about some of the brands and things to think about. Essentially, there's 9 types of cannabis brands. At least my travels across the country and around the world, I'm trying to basically categorize, right? And I'm trying to sort of better understand how people are affected by these hooks that the brands are using. So, one, counterculture, right? That's almost obvious. But when you think about counterculture, it could be Bob Marley, it could be Tommy Chong. It's basically, so it could cross from entertainers to influencers to actors to musicians, but essentially it's counterculture. It's saying, fuck the man, this is, you know, this is the fuck the man brand, right? So counterculture. The second one is influencer, which seems to be, you know, not only running rampant in the cannabis industry, but in my opinion, a total flop in many ways. And I would also caveat that by saying there's many types of influencers, right? So, so an influencer here could be Whoopi Goldberg's products. It could be Snoop Dogg's products, all the way down to you know, other folks that are related to the cannabis industry, a Dave Chappelle brand. I just got Carlos Santana is interested in now, you know, having his own brand. So his manager reached out to me. But again, this to me is a Willie Nelson brand. Those types of things are influencer brands. A medical is more like a dose, which used to be Humboldt, which is again, you know, a brand that would come in a white package. It's hermetically sealed. It looks very medical. It would typically appeal more to a patient than anybody else. An excellent example of a charity or cause, there's a brand out of California called Give. And so what they've done, so every time you purchase a cannabis product, whether it's a pre-roll or a gram or an eighth, so on and so forth, they give a portion of the proceeds to a local charity. So that's what they're all about. Which, by the way, they've managed to do that, but that's been pretty tough because there have been lots of cannabis companies that want to give to charities, and the charities won't take the money, just FYI, which is amazing to me. Fifth one is Foodie and Epicurean. It's been really interesting for me to see, like, over the last, I want to say 5 or 6 years. So you have all these chocolate brands, and they started off at all the trade shows coming with their chocolate bars. And now all of a sudden they're coming with fondue kits and you know, like the chocolate's melted and they've got their marshmallows and everything else. And so to me, that's a sign of normalization. It's sort of, you know, it's a level of sophistication, which means there's a different type of clientele coming in. And if it's not a different type of clientele, it's the same, but they feel more comfortable because now they're not pulling the chocolate bar out of their pocket and taking a bite of it and putting it back. Now they're actually at home or out with their friends creating an event with fondue around this product. So it's just a different approach, which to me reads normalization and socialization of the product. But also, you know, Foodie is very much, you know, in line with what's going on. And so I'm talking, like here, when I talk about Foodie, I'm talking about edibles on some level, but even the mentality is a Foodie mentality now. You know, again, I don't know, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, none of my friends were talking about terps. None of my friends were talking about THC and CBD. None of the people and these people were big consumers, but that just wasn't being discussed. So now if you're a cultivator, you talk like a foodie. It's very much like wine, right? You know, when wine picked up, everyone spoke about tannins and all the other things that are in wine and had a vocabulary to discuss it. And now we have that in cannabis as well. And again, I just came back from New York and spoke with my friends about it, and they're all rolling their eyes because I've got this whole new vocabulary, and people aren't smokers or users, they're consumers now. And it's not marijuana, it's cannabis, and it's, you know, and all these other things. So it's just interesting to sort of see that. The cultivator brand, you know, to me, a cultivator brand, you know, ranges anywhere from, let's say, the folks up in Washington at Gold Leaf, where they talk about they're from Hawaii, so they're all about their teas and their worm piles and you know, all the things that basically take place in soil preparation. There's other folks like the Jungle Boys or 3 Pounds of Light or Exotics or other things which are all, you know, sort of cultivator based. Prohibition, there's legal and there's proof and there's so many Prohibition brands, but you know, that in itself is a category. Art and design brands, whether it be a Lola Lola out of Washington or some of the others which feature local artists. All the packages are limited edition. Again, those sorts of things which kind of add to the value of their offering. And then finally, novelty. There's lots of novelty brands out there. Out of Washington, there's a brand called Fire Truck. Basically, it's the word fire truck with the fire truck in front of the letters, so you only see the F, the U, the C, and the K. You know, so yes.
Could you say more about the Prohibition category?
Sure.
I wasn't getting that.
Yeah, so Prohibition is basically a reference to alcohol. So for example, there's a brand called Proof. That brand is a pre-roll in a small little, the one shooter. You know.
Translating between alcohol and, okay, got it.
That's right, that's right. And then even taking it further where the brand is called Proof with the percentage signs, so you're equating the alcohol proof to the high potent THC level. So
Right.
yeah, so it's like the malt liquor of cannabis, if you will. You know, but even that, right? That's a promise, the malt liquor of cannabis. So So basically, I mean, these are the 9 categories that I see, and if anybody else has any others, please feel free to share them with me. But I think these are the general boxes that everything falls into. And when I start to look at that, I start to say, okay, I get it. I understand why those are things that people sort of riff on, and resonate with people. So I would also say if folks are building brands, if they're thinking about brands, if they have stories about their brands, they should be really mindful about these, because that's pretty much the stories that are being told. And even though they might be slight different stories, I mean, I almost think about this as like if I walked into a bookstore and there were aisles of different types of books with different types of stories, those would be the headers on the tops of the aisles which tell me to walk down. So whichever one, right, whichever one you choose, I think you need to be consistent, so with the logo, with the packaging, with your website. I think essentially this one slide I could basically say Apple, everything for the most part is white, it's super clean, but it's really consistent. More than anything, when you're opening an Apple box. You could actually probably even be blindfolded and open an Apple product and kind of have a feeling it might be an Apple product, which is pretty amazing. When I worked at Microsoft, I was on a team called the UBI team, which was the OOBE, which is the out-of-box experience. So it was people that came together from different teams that worked on this. And it wasn't put together until Apple came out and just had such amazing products that Microsoft said, holy shit, taking a product out of a box is part of this? We didn't realize that, but it is. I mean, it starts from the moment they walk out of the Apple store with that bag and that box, and they skip through the parking lot, and they're sort of showing it off to certain people and hoping that it's not going to get stolen from other people. It's that sort of thing. But that's what the consistency of a brand is. So know your customer. I'll say this. I was one of the few initial guys at Pepsi, because of my skateboarding background, to build out the Mountain Dew brand 100 years ago. And one of the things we knew was who we were appealing to. We were appealing to dudes. We were going to make a fluorescent green, carbonated, high-sugar drink and appeal to skateboarders. Man, that was so easy. It was just like all my friends, it was perfect. Cannabis is so different in the sense that you kind of think you know who you're appealing to, which again, if you look at all the data, it's probably those dudes again, right? Because, more often it skews male going into a shop and they're in their 20s. But we're not so sure if that's really who they are. And in fact, I've got friends that own stores up in Washington, and they started off thinking we're going to have a high rate of males, 20-something males come into our store to buy weed. Well, it turns out 2 to 3 years later, they're doing wisdom programs with the assisted living homes all around Seattle, and they're busing people in on Sundays to come in to buy, their cannabis products, which is just amazing. So, so with that, I don't think people really in the industry understand who their customer is, and that's key. And I think stereotypically we think our customer is somebody different than it is. And so I think what's happening now with the normalization of cannabis, I think people are more open to it. Well, obviously they're more open to it, and things are changing. But that's going to, but those people are going to come out of the closet, and all of a sudden you're going to realize, hey, there are actually people using cannabis, like my father's wife, who's in her 80s for her hip pain, and all of a sudden it's okay because she sees it on the news, or because it was written up in Forbes magazine or something like that. It all of a sudden becomes okay. So with that, knowing your customer is really key, and I think in our industry, making assumptions about your customer can be really, really dangerous. So align with customer reality. Again, I'll use my friend's dispensary, as the example. He started off thinking he was going to have lots of guys come in and looking for high potency THC. Now he's actually years later again selling to folks over 65 that are looking for low THC, and high CBD strains. So brand unity is key, right? So simply put, there's an internal story that goes on. It's you and your partners and what you want to be when you grow up and all of that good stuff. Then there's an external story which is going on, which is, you know, what your customers really think of you, and really the final platform is how do you you know, the gap is how do you bring these things together, which is really important. And again, I'll go back to my previous slide, which is it's hard to do that if you don't know who your customers are, because you don't know what they want from you. And that, I think, is the biggest problem in our industry today. And you know, mostly the emotional connection. You know, when customers feel emotionally positive about a brand, they intuitively trust it, and trust is the reason that brands exist, right? The whole thing, and I guess the key to all of this is that takes so long to do, to build somebody's trust. It takes so long to do. And just think in your personal lives. But it takes less than a second for somebody to you break that trust, right? And so that's why it's so difficult. Brands don't have that second chance. If your brother or sister kind of messes with you, you could always go back. You could talk to mom or dad, or, you know, go back a little bit later. If a brand doesn't land on its promise, you'll never give it a second chance, especially today because everybody's so hypersensitive. So one of the last slides here is to differentiate. I have a really great slide. I pulled it actually because of this statistic. So almost 85% of cannabis brands across the country, I mean from Colorado to California to Washington to Oregon, 85% of the brands are blue and green and have a cannabis leaf in it. So when you think about that, and by the way, I had a slide where I showed all these different brands, and actually I put them on this green background so you almost couldn't see them, because that's what happens when you walk into a dispensary and every brand has a pot leaf and every brand is blue and green. There's no differentiation. And I'm not necessarily saying, you know, it should be yellow and red and make your McDonald's brand or something that contrasts, but it's important to note in a sea of blue and green how you stand out and how you differentiate. You know, that could be your color scheme, that could be your name, that could be your packaging, that could be so many different things. But I'm finishing up my book, which is going to launch in June, called Branding Bud, the Commercialization of Cannabis. And actually, it was my designer. I had gone out, we had photographed thousands of products, and my designer said, do you see what's happening here? As we started to lay out all the products, we started to realize that all the products were blue and green and had pot leaves on them. So that in itself became a chapter, which was like, how do you differentiate? You know, and as brand owners, I don't necessarily know if people go out and you know, travel to all the states and meet with all the other brand owners and so on and so forth. And I mean, essentially, when I said I'm writing a book, and I reached out to people, they basically said, sure, let me show you everything. And so I've spent the last 3 years, you know, traveling around the U.S. meeting brand owners. And thank God they've been, you know, super open about it. And so now I have that knowledge. I don't necessarily know if I said, hey, I'm going to create a brand in California, can I come look at your stuff, if they'd let me in the door. But I'm hoping that what I've seen and the information I'm sharing today and I'm about to share in my book, you know, will not hurt any single company, but will help the industry as a whole. You know, where people start to think of cannabis brands as consumer brands. They'll think of a sublingual strip differently than they'll think as a transdermal patch. They'll probably market that like a Listerine slip or a Band-Aid. And the folks that are developing, you know, other products will package those in ways that we're used to and we're accustomed to. So with that, I think that was my last slide. So does branding matter? I think so. But I'm happy to take any questions or talk more about anything specific if you guys have anything. Yeah.
I'm actually hoping if you could go back to the brand unity slide.
Mm-hmm. Oops, there it is. You're just taking notes? Okay. Anybody else?
So do you have idea from your previous brand experiences about when the industry reaches a critical mass about the normalization that you're talking about? I mean, is that 5 years, 10 years? Is that when a certain number of states are legal? You know, what's your thinking?
Well, my thinking is actually when it's federally legal, that's going to happen, because that's when cannabis will be able to cross state lines. That's when you'll have you'll either have multiple processing facilities, or you'll be able to cross state lines. So right now, the way cannabis works is essentially the way Pepsi and Coke work right now. So think about it this way. Pepsi has bottling companies. So Pepsi's headquarters are in New York. They develop brands there, and they have bottling companies in different states. And the reason they do that is because they don't want to move liquid across the country. They could make it locally. Essentially what that does is that creates almost a similar model. So you have the bottling companies and their licensing deals with the parent company, and it's very similar to cannabis now. So I created a company in Washington State, and all of a sudden I want that brand to be in Oregon. Well, either I have to open up a shop, I have to get a license and become a producer and or processor here, or I create a license with somebody that's already a producer or processor here. Because of different legal reasons, you don't often want to pay royalties, because that's not necessarily allowed. So the way you do it is the person in the company and the brand in Washington will buy a package and sell it to a company in Oregon with a markup. And that's the money that they make, right? And then the Oregon company takes that package, fills the package, and sells it and makes their money. That model isn't going to change until the federal level changes. So my gut is there'll be brands, they'll become national brands, but those national brands will have to be funded with so much money, because they basically either have to build out operating units in different states, or they have to do licensing deals with other manufacturers. So now you're probably going to find companies that are going to create portfolios of brands in different states, and then you'll probably find, which will most likely be packagers and processors, and then there'll be cultivators which will feed into that, and then they'll sell the brands. And it will be specialized, right? So you'll have people that are growing, you have people that are processing, and you have people that are probably distributing and then selling or retailing. But it's going to be a while.
Yeah, it's both exciting and a little sad to think of that stage of commercialization.
I agree. I mean, I think the best, people talk about the tomato model, and I think that's the best model. So if you think about tomatoes, right, you can go out and buy seeds and have a garden in your backyard and grow your own tomatoes. And let's just say there's so many tomatoes, right, just like strains. So you get to choose your heirlooms or your cherry tomatoes. You could grow it in your own backyard. But you can also go to the supermarket, and you can either buy low-end tomatoes, or you could go to the boutique Whole Foods and go get your super duper tomatoes. But they're available in many different ways, and that I think would be the optimal way.
Yeah.
One other thing, just to harp on here for a sec. So I think another issue is, so today cannabis, we call it either recreational or medicinal. And in my opinion, it's not medicinal. It's therapeutic. Medicinal, in my mind, medicinal is when your doctor prescribes it, you can go get it somewhere in a dose, and insurance pays for it.
Yeah.
That's what medicinal is. So, again, I think that sort of platform has to sort of open itself up a little bit before there's normalization. Anybody else? Yeah.
Do you see regional differences in branding now, and as normalization might happen with legalization at the Fed level, you see those regional brands pushing through?
Yeah, and it's not only regional brand, it's form factor too. So I'll say this: being a New Yorker and growing up in New York, you always think you're smarter than the rest of the country, right? and then I've been in Seattle for 12 years, and when I go back to New York, it's like they're a bunch of idiots. They know nothing about cannabis, and even I shouldn't say that, and I'm being recorded too. Sorry, New Yorkers. But here's what happens. So, for example, in the medical dispensaries in New York, there's no flower. So there's no flower because they believe that medical patients aren't going to smoke. And that's just one way of thinking about it. So even there, you can pay $400 for a license in New York. You can go into a dispensary and you won't find flower. So there's still a huge black market for flower in New York. And again, it prevents any brand development on the flower side, whereas, here in Oregon or Washington, it's like, of course there's flower brands. So I think it stunts brand development, but it's also about form factor wherever you go as well. So oils and tinctures and vapes and transdermal slips and sublingual slips are really big in New York right now. Which is interesting because it's also discrete, right? I think of cannabis products as discrete and non-discrete. So non-discrete is the big blunt you light up, and everybody within 100 yards of you knows you're or someone's smoking. And discrete is the chocolate or whatever that you're kind of. It's the soccer mom approach, I call it. So, anyway, anybody else? Cool. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.